In this new series, What Lurks Beneath, will be giving you 2 hours of horrific cryptid and paranormal accounts from each of the 50 states. Tonight's episode will be starting with Washington State, my home state. Enjoy. My friends and I were out on a hike through Snoqualmie Pass in Washington State. We came across something that had us all very confused. We were right above Snoqualmie Pass, right around several thousand feet up. We hiked about an hour away from the pass to this very desolate area where there's nearly nobody else hiking besides us. And we saw these really strange coyotes. They were walking upright, like humans do. They even bent their back forward, like somebody else does when they're picking up something off the ground. All 3 of us agreed it wasn't a dog. If you looked closely at them, you could see how it walked differently than any other canine would. The front legs also moved too similar to a human leg. If it ran into some brush or something, it makes sense that would have gone over it. The second thing was the movement of the tail. Dogs seem to wag their tail more side to side when they're excited, while the tail of these animals moved up and down. Also, they were extremely skinny but not starving. This leads me to believe it wasn't a lack of food or water that led them to walking upright, because I'm still scratching my head at this one. We saw 3 of them at once. Then, another one, 30 minutes later, which we witnessed for longer. Also, another strange thing was the eyes. In trail cam footage that I've seen before of coyotes and foxes, their eyes will catch light and reflect, showing red very brightly in photos. However, these coyotes' eyes did not reflect like that. I know you are probably thinking we were looking at foxes, but they looked nothing like them. Even the ears looked different. They were more like an elf on top of the head, and the tips of the ears were more pointed. This was back in March of 2017. We had also found some trail cam footage of these same animals on YouTube from somebody who took photos around that time, which would match up with what we saw. None of us have ever seen something like this before, so it felt really weird seeing them. I remember being a bit scared, but our curiosity outweighed that feeling, and we just simply watched these animals for about 30 minutes before they all disappeared into the brush. In terms of what these animals were doing, they were just walking around in circles, looking for something to eat or scavenging from the ground, or so it appeared. My friends and I weren't far enough away from them to see if they were digging up roots or grubs, or whatever else coyotes hunt for food. Justin is one of the witnesses. His brother, who lives in Idaho, said he would check out what was going on at night. His trail cams would always catch some weird things. He found that he also had caught pictures of these animals too, walking upright, and other strange things. After he sent us some pictures, they looked exactly like the ones we had saw. He lives in eastern Idaho. It's pretty high up there too, roughly around the same feet above sea level. He also saw them back in February of 2016. I'm not sure if that's exactly significant or not. Please let me know if you have any questions. I hope this can help. We were camping in a very remote area of western Washington. This area is called the Long Beach Peninsula. It's beautiful and remote. All forested coastline with lots of intertidal life, big rocks that jut up from the water. Lots of great hiking trails too into old-growth forests. But few people even know it exists, since there's not a whole lot of roads around. The only way to get there, it seems, is by trekking in. Anyway, we had been at this beach for about 3 days now, and we're exploring some areas near the coast, where the wild grass grew between huge granite boulders. You could also see evidence of logging from a long time ago, but they stopped access for loggers do their thing, due to it being too difficult to get equipment in. We were walking quietly along the rocks, when my mother spotted something large in the grass, only about 50 or so yards up. It appeared to be like a really big deer standing still, but when we saw its ears sticking up, we realized it was too thick to be a Sitka deer. It was brown, almost like dark brown, and way bigger than any cow you've ever seen. At least the head shape was not any cow or deer I had ever seen either. Long story short, this thing stood there for at least 5 minutes while we watched from behind cover, thinking how lucky we were that it did not see us. If somebody had been alone, they would have literally run into the trees screaming for their life. My mom was in the lead when she saw it. I was in the middle, and my aunt was at the back, since she doesn't like to hike much and has had fresh hip surgery. We all got good looks at this thing's face when it turned around to look toward us once or twice. It had a bit of a snout, but not really. I don't know how to describe it because I have never seen anything like it. We were up in Washington State, about 2 hours north of Portland, Oregon, near Long Beach Peninsula. We stayed on a gravel road called Twin Harbors Road, just off the 101, close to Joyce, Washington to Ocean Shores, Washington. When I was younger, about 8, me and my family were on a camping trip in Washington State. I don't remember where we went, but it was either around Mount Adams or Mount Hood. Somewhere around there. Forgive me if it's the wrong state, but I'm from Colorado, and it's either one of those two mountains. My dad had been trying to hunt down a Wendigo for months with no luck, even though they're supposed to be in the Pacific Northwest in Canada. He really wanted one, so we could kill it. He apparently managed to track one down and set up an ambush by a lake right before dusk. The plan was for me and my little brother, 13 at the time, to stay back while my parents distracted it with some berries that were poisonous when uncooked, just like when the Wendigo's saliva is poisonous when it bites you. And keep in mind that at the time, we thought he was hunting deer. He never told us what he was hunting. It wasn't until later he told us that he was hunting Wendigo. Apparently, he knew the Wendigo liked to eat berries, and once it ate these, he was going to shoot it with a tranquilizer gun, hogtie it, take it back to the car, which is parked several miles away, and kill it. So, me and my brother are waiting in this little shack shed that belonged to some older farmers for hours until we finally hear the gunshots. We bolt out of the shed, ready, fight or flight, whatever comes first. But as soon as we open that door, we see nothing but our parents' footsteps disappearing into the woods. My dad's instincts kicked in hard at this point. He jumped onto his motorcycle. He kept one hidden there and revved up full throttle, hightailing it in the direction of our car. My brother and I just stood there in silence for a minute. We look down and see that the ground before us is rumbling. Something big is coming. Just as we were about to bolt and run for our lives, this hoofed creature comes bursting out right in front of us. It looked like deer's feet, but way bigger, blacker, and more menacing. Now that it was too late to run, my brother starts freaking out, asking me what's going on. My brother and I ran and ran until we came up the hill towards where the shed was. This thing had chased us all the way up there, but my dad and mom were down there firing at this thing. I think they hit it once or twice, because as soon as a bullet struck it, it veered off path, going left into the woods. My dad commanded us to stay back in the shed and not leave. He came and got us a few hours later. We had been trembling and shaking the whole time. My dad, who was covered in blood, not his own of course, seemed very unnerved and on edge. He didn't kill it. Instead, he told us that he made this thing angry, and it was trying to come back for him, and we need to leave now before the sun set. And that's all about I remember from that trip. He refuses to talk about it, even now. Brothers and I were camping in Osoyoos. We were at the end of a trail that was all sand. It began to rain as we went back to the cars, so we decided to wait out the storm and shoot our guns off. I don't remember exactly if it was legal or not. I shot off my measly .22 about 4 or 5 times. My brothers shot off their rifles, while my other brother took some video on his phone. As we're leaving, we head down about halfway to this ridge, down the trail, when one of us noticed something moving on the ridge of a nearby hill. It looked like somebody was just standing there, like another person had showed up behind them and motioned for them to come down the ridge together. They both headed towards our direction slowly, Then they began to quickly run down the hill. We didn't know what to do, so we just stood there until they were about 100 yards away from us. Then, my brother turned on his rifle light, turning it on. They stopped, but continued motioning for us to come towards them. I was scared but really curious at this point, so I took a step forward, getting ready to run away if necessary, and they both just disappeared. My brothers said they saw something shaped like a person, and that kind of shimmered out of existence. What we saw were large humanoid shadows. I don't believe it was Bigfoot at all. Like I said, it looked like a large person, but dark and shadowy. We decided to get out of Dodge. We were driving back to the car when we heard a noise behind us. We turned around and saw a big thing standing in the middle of the road, about 50 yards away. It looked like a hairy bear man, and I wasn't sure, but I thought it had blood on it. Then it kind of got down on all fours and began sprinting at our car, gaining speed. So we sped out of there pretty quick, to be honest. We didn't take any photos or videos. Between the shadows we saw and this hairy monster, there's no telling what it is we really encountered. Me and my mother-in-law were camping with our family in the early 1990s. Our campsite was located on a small ridge above a river, maybe 200 yards away from the water. My mother-in-law and her sister said they saw something down by the river that night during dinner. They did not say what. It was just that it had red eyes and that they glowed. The campground we stayed at also had one of those houses with 2 jars hanging upside down for used toilet paper to collect. My brother-in-law, who went to use the facility, later reported seeing glowing green eyes staring at him through the crack between the boards. This is right when he busted open one of the toilets to investigate why there wasn't any more paper. He refused to go back inside. The next night, while sitting around the campfire, my father-in-law saw some movement between the surrounding trees and also reported hearing loud screams. I was watching my younger brother at the time. He was around 5 years old at the time of this incident. As soon as I had looked up from him, something began running towards us through the trees, on the trail, on all fours. It was this large dark silhouette that stood on 2 legs when it abruptly stopped, only about 40 feet away from us. Then, it crouched down on 2 legs, on its knees and arms outstretched. My son wanted to go investigate. It sounded like his older brother, so I grabbed him before he can get too far, only to lose sight of whatever it was. That's when we were back under our tent lights. We packed up early the next day, leaving as soon as possible. I do want to say that my father-in-law was a bit of a drinker at the time, and I think that is why they did not believe him when he said he saw something earlier. But me and my mother-in-law absolutely saw something as well. This wasn't a bear or anything else. We could not find an explanation for. My brother-in-law described what we saw as some kind of monster, and I agree with him. As such, I believe there was more than one of these things roaming and camping around in the woods that night. Guess I better be careful when I'm out in the woods of the Pacific Northwest. My name is Casey. I'm 20 years old, and I live in Washington State. I grew up with my mom not far from the forest. Heck, most of the state is nothing but forest. So most of my childhood was spent exploring it after dark. I remember one night when I was around 8 or 9 years old, and my best friend and I at the time came to a small opening in the trees, just big enough to fit a driveway or a medium-sized house. We went into it thinking there might be some treasure. You know how kids are. We thought we could take it home and sell it. Well, not long after, we began hearing what sounded like branches breaking all around us, and noise and rustling. But there wasn't anything we could see in sight, and this didn't sound like any normal wildlife. And eventually, it got so loud that we both became terrified. We couldn't even bring ourselves to run. We just stayed frozen in the same spot until it stopped. At about 10 minutes later, we heard a voice calling our names from far away. It sounded like my friend's dad. So finally, feeling safe, We started backing up the driveway, slowly, when all of a sudden, something at least 7 feet tall emerged from the woods, its hands outstretched towards us, like it was coming for us. We started screaming, and before I could even register what was happening, we were just yelling "run" back and forth, and we ran home as silent as we could. And I haven't mentioned that night to anybody for years. Whatever that big hairy monster was reaching its arms out at us, trying to grab us. As time went on, after that incident, I began having strange dreams about an entity calling my name from the woods, calling it in my daddy's voice. There was never anything there when I walked out, but I could still feel this presence. One night, when I was a little older, about 14 or 15, me and a different friend were walking home from school. Well, actually, I had spent quite a bit of time at her house, so it was around 8 p.m., and we were walking home. We had just passed my house when we had heard something going, rustling off in the tall grass on the side of the road. We get closer to where the sound was coming from, and these 5 huge dog-like creatures emerge, and they start coming towards us, mouths open, showing teeth. I screamed for my friend to run, but before she got away, she tripped, and one of these things gained on her and got very close to her. I tried to run as fast as I could back home, but there was no way I could have outrun them. But as I looked behind me as I'm running, they all ran towards her, and it looked like they got her. I made it safely in my house, and I was so terrified of what to do. My dad saw that I was terrified, and I couldn't tell him what had just happened. I didn't have the guts to. Next thing I know, I'm getting a call from my friend's parents about an hour later. She never returned back home, and I told her mom that she was fine when she dropped me off and was headed back home. I couldn't dare tell her what had happened, that she had been attacked by these wolf creatures. She was not at school the next day, and I found out that police were called and they were searching for her. They never found her. Of course, I was questioned and asked, but I said the same story. I knew nobody would believe me, even at 15, if I were to tell them these giant wolves came out and took her away. Even now, all these years later, that story feels so fake, but it's something that I live with. Do you know of any other stories like this that are similar? I lived in a very rural area in central Washington. It's still very rural, but I've since moved away, and this story has been haunting me for years. I was what you'd probably call a scaredy cat when I was younger, and even now, I guess I'm still a bit of a coward, even though I watch lots of things like horror movies and scary images. Although, I was never afraid of the dark or ever being alone. But if it were up to me to choose who went into the haunted house at a local fair every year, you guessed it. So, this day, I had just gotten home from school one afternoon, right around 4 p.m. It must have been sometime in April. For whatever reason, my mother was not home yet, so I waited on the front porch for her before coming in. The spring air was crisp, like it usually is, how things go from cold to warm. But the sun was shining, and it wasn't too cold or too warm yet. After about 15 minutes of just sitting on our porch steps, I saw what looked like a truck go past my house, and it looked like the driver was slowly driving by, looking for something out his window on the other side of the road at the woods. So I'm sitting there, and he goes by. Then I see him go by again, and a third time, and he's definitely looking for something. Slowly driving by, scouting out. And as I'm sitting there, I begin to hear growling. So I start looking around, and I see this thing coming out of the hedges right near my house. It was tall and dark, having these huge claws, and it kind of reminded me of a hyena, with how it looked. Very striking eyes, and it began to slowly pace its way towards me, right around the driveway. I was completely panic-stricken, so I jump up, not knowing what this large dog is. I run in the house, and I lock the door, and I throw myself against the door. Now I could hear it outside the house, pacing, growling, and after about 5 or so minutes, things go quiet. Then, shortly after, I hear my mother pop up. and I hear her voice. She's on the phone talking to somebody. She tries to get in the house and wonders why I'm up against the door. I let her in and I tell her, I saw this big dog that was trying to get us. It looked like a hyena and looked like nothing I've ever seen before. She totally downplayed it, but thought I was just having a stressful day or a nightmare, even though I was clearly awake and I was outside, just waiting for her to get home. I almost wonder if that older guy driving around, pacing down the street in his truck, if that was the dog he was looking for. I didn't see him anymore. So fast forward to that night, and I'm lying in bed, trying to go to sleep, and I hear something at my window. I turn in my bed to look, and it's that same dog from earlier, pressing its face up against the window, dragging its face back and forth, getting snot and saliva all over the window. It looks pissed, and it looks like it's running in my window. I start screaming, and I run up out of my bed into my mom's room. Now she's freaking out at me, cussing at me, wondering why I'm acting so ridiculous. I explain to her there's something trying to get in my room. She gets up, flicks on my light. There's nothing out there, but the saliva trail and snot is all over the window. She just tells me, honey, don't worry about it. It's probably just a friendly neighborhood dog. And fortunately, I convinced her that I should sleep on her floor for the next few nights, which I did. I just grabbed a sleeping bag, I could care less about the hard floor, and I slept there. After that, I had no more run-ins with this strange hyena dog thing that was attacking our house. This was all the way back in 2009 now, when I was in middle school. Haven't seen it or heard of it since. Back in 1995, I was coming back from a camping trip on the Olympic Peninsula, driving southbound on the 101, right around where it intersects with Road 2501, a Forest Service road. It was later in the summer, so it wasn't quite dark out yet. It would have been somewhere around 5 p.m. Luckily, a buddy of mine had a cell phone with him, because the story could have gotten really bad really fast if he did not. I looked down to my right and saw what appeared to be a small bear running alongside the off-road, not far ahead of me. This is nothing new at all. Washington State is home to many black bear. But I keep watching as we get closer, expecting my friend to see it too, but he never does. And then all of a sudden, that bear started moving into the middle of the road. I stomp on the brakes, swerving, trying to avoid hitting it. But at the last second, I saw it. This big, nasty wolf, easily weighing 80 pounds if not more. The front of my car hitting it hard enough to send it flying and out into the opposite lane, to land in front of another car that was coming our way. The other driver hits it too, and it lands dead in the road. But there was something odd about this wolf. It did not look like a normal wolf. So my friend and I get out, along with the other driver, who we started to call 911. We all circled around where the wolf had landed to see if it was okay. It wasn't moving. We could tell it was dead. And as we stood around it, we were all like, what the is that? We realized this was not a wolf, but something different. It was very muscular, and honestly, dare I say, looked like a miniature werewolf, probably about 4 to 5 feet tall. It had very long front arms, very large hands with black claws. Its face was very fierce looking, but its tongue was hanging out of its mouth and blood pouring out of its mouth. Its eyes were wide open, and part of its spine was bent. Its back legs were much shorter than its front, and it was colored very similar to that of a wolf, but grayer. The hair was also a lot more thinner and shorter. This thing was incredibly muscular. It was kind of human-looking. Even the teeth were terrifying. They did not look like canine teeth. Everyone was completely curved and razor-sharp. This thing was some sort of wolfman hybrid or something. Even the other driver was freaking out. And so I was thinking, did me and this other driver hit and kill a baby werewolf, or a dogman? Because neither of us could really discern what this was that we hit. After 911 showed up to investigate, we were released and who knows what they did with the body. But the thing that freaked me out is, If that was a baby, that means Mama had to have been close by, and I would not have wanted to see what Mama looked like. Howdy. I'm a first-hand witness to what I would call a werebear. This was in 1997, on Old West Side of Monroe, Washington. It was out by where all those huge trees are in that line by the highway when you come into town from the west. We had just exited off the main highway and driven through Sultan, Washington to get out there. Once we got to Monroe, my mom, who was driving, wanted us to go out into the farmland area. It's actually pretty hilly around there. She said it would be easier for me to throw up outside if I began feeling carsick, like I did most of the trip after morning sickness hit me hard that day. So we stopped by this little dirt road opening with an old break in its concrete. It had never gotten fixed. We got out of the car. My mom looked back again to make sure I was all right. And then she walked around back, watching me as I recovered from feeling sick. Now, this road wasn't really a road at all, more like a break in the trees with some grass growing up through it. It kind of dead-ended into one of another farm's property, but you could still see all the way down, maybe half a mile, where there were 3 houses back to back on each other's property line, which were owned by what looked like Amish folk, based on the horses in the property and their pastures. Just as my mother turned to walk away towards her side of the car, I saw something running alongside, outside the corner of my eye. It made me turn and look. It was large, very large, and running on 2 legs. It ran like a man would, an Olympic runner, except you could tell by its movements alone there was something very different about it. Both my mother and I, our eyes locked on this thing as it was coming across the road, and I could almost make out the shape of a human-like face on this thing. It kind of made me shudder. It was covered in large black hair. This thing was the size of a bear, incredibly huge. And then it disappeared into the woods as it turned and ran back. My mother immediately went around to the other side of my car, told me to get back inside when she saw this thing running towards us and then running back. Safe to say, we got back in the car and drove slowly up ahead. She wanted to have a look at where this thing disappeared to, after seeing how fast it moved away, and it most certainly was not a person or a bear. As we reached the end of the little dirt road opening, my mom stopped for a second, looked ahead into the trees and on the other side. I followed her, looking more closely too, and I see it again. This time it was standing in front of a tree, but all I could see were its claws as it stood there, staring at us from behind a few branches. It had long, spindly fingers, very long black nails, or what appeared to be claws on them, and they were raised up, gripping the trunk of this tree behind. My mother began screaming and driving forward, slowly, not wanting to scare it away. Then it ran out from behind the tree and disappeared behind us. We still don't know what this was, but it was freaky looking. It kind of looked like a large bear, but the head was different. Like, imagine for a moment, a bear, upright like a man, at least the legs of a man, but the upper body of a bear, and the head of a half-human, half-bear. That's what it reminded me of, or so what it looked like. It was not a Bigfoot. It did not look like a human. It looked like something I've never seen before, and it certainly freaked my mother out. When I was a kid, I had a very heartfelt and personal experience. My family was not well off, but we were doing fine financially. We lived on a farm in the country with very little human contact outside of our own community. We had lots of land, with mostly horses as our livestock. Our closest neighbors were 8 miles away from us, and we only had one road connecting us to them. It wasn't exactly uncommon for kids to go days without seeing another person besides their own families if they chose to. My sister and I used to play out in the fields around our house, come back when we got hungry or needed water, or if we got hurt or something like that. When we ran into each other while playing, there was no rush for us either to head home. We'd share things like toys or food, then get back out there into the world that we lived in. One day, I was exploring a very dry creek bed near where we lived, and I saw something dart up and over an embankment next to me. It really startled me. It moved so quickly and silently through the trees and across the ground. I could hear nothing but leaves brushing. As soon as this thing disappeared from sight, my stomach sank, and I got a very bad feeling in the pit of my stomach. Like premonition bad luck type stuff. So instead of stopping to think about what just jumped over the hill, I ran as fast as my 7-year-old legs could possibly carry me, back towards my house. And then I saw it. This large thing lumbering out of the bush and onto the path in front of me. It was almost as tall as I was, but it walked with its chest puffed out, and it looked just like a hideous goblin or something. It looked dirty and hairy, and had tusks coming out of its mouth. It was covered in filth. I always think back and think it was some sort of garbage monster or something. It was just gross looking. I just ran as fast as my little legs could possibly carry me, not daring to look behind and see how close it was to me. I remember it tried to reach out and grab me and pull me away, but luckily I evaded its reach. When I was within sight of the house, I nearly collapsed. I got back inside and still had that sickly feeling in my stomach. That feeling had now been replaced with a newfound sense of courage and victory. I can remember vividly, too, afterwards, that whole little path and section of the forest reeked like rotting meat for the next few days afterwards. I don't even want to know what that thing was. In 1934, I was born in a small town of about 200 souls. We lived on a homestead with my 2 brothers, parents, and grandmother. My father had been raised on this land by his own grandfather, who made his living as a trapper and subsistence hunter. From the time he was old enough to walk, my father spent most of his waking hours out in the surrounding woods. There were no schools outside of town then. He had only an 8th grade education, but became a very successful businessman when he grew up. His business partner for many years was an investigator with several degrees. This is where I come in. You see, Grandpa Harold taught me everything he knew about life in the forest and how to survive. When I was just 9, my dad had developed a terminal lung disease that ultimately killed him just 2 years later. Needless to say, our family completely devastated by the loss. It took me many years to realize the full impact of what had happened. But I have come to understand that losing our father left us all somewhat broken. My mother remarried soon after Dad died, and we went to live with her new husband on his ranch in eastern Washington. That's where the story really begins. I would be about 25 or 26 at this point, working as a professional land surveyor for local counties around Yakima. At least, I thought I was still a land surveyor. One night, I was working a graveyard shift, 11 p.m. to 7, right around an old duplex office, packing up my gear and planning to go home when my boss called me out of the blue. He needed help with some work he had been contracted for about 4 hours away. He needed some help because apparently he had hired some new workers who didn't exactly prove to be competent. So I agreed and off there I went in the middle of the night. The following morning when I arrived at the job site, my boss introduced me around and they handed me a huge pile of topographic maps. He informed me that I needed to walk down each of these roads and check sheets, measure off all the trees in the area that have been marked by surveyors' flagging tape. At first, I thought it was odd they would be asking a woman to walk down remote roads, all alone measuring trees. I'd only been walking for maybe 15 minutes when my worst fears came true. It happened in a place where the road made a sharp turn, and there was an old dilapidated barn that had collapsed years before, and I spotted him. Something out behind the woods that looked like a large hairy man, or somebody in a large gorilla costume, which I thought it was initially, until I saw how big it was and how it moved, and how its eyes looked. I was scared. It began darting away from me in the trees and started making this whooping sound, smacking the tree really hard with this large mini log. I dropped my check sheets and ran back to the office as fast as I could. When I got there, they demanded to know what had happened on the job site and just why I was so pale. I told them I saw this big hairy man that came out from behind the dilapidated barn and scaring me half to death. They laughed me out of the office at first, but they themselves went outside to check things out. He too quickly ate his words, as he saw something or someone come out of those woods around that barn, chasing him in a hurry. Whatever that hairy man was still there, and my boss after that simply refused to ever talk about it or bring it up. I couldn't exactly tell you what it was, because the Patterson film had not even come out yet. But I believe now, after all these years later, it was indeed some type of Bigfoot. And I still wonder what might have happened if my boss never called me, asking me to come all the way down when he did. What if it had just been him going out there? Because originally, it was going to have to be him. Or one of the newbies. Maybe something worse would have happened. And I still remember all of this like it was yesterday. When you have a sighting like that, it definitely makes an impact on your life. It even affects me now when I'm in the woods. There'll be days I'm hiking and I feel like I'm not alone. I get this eerie feeling like something or somebody is watching me, and they're right behind me. But when I turn around, there's never anybody there. It could be a ghost, or it could be one of these hairy Bigfoot-like men. I haven't been back to that area or site in quite some time. In many, many years. In fact, it was probably a good 12 years before I even came back. With my own husband, and while I didn't feel or see anything, there was a really awful musty stench lingering in the area. Although I never connected the two together. It just smelled like a really, really potent skunk. But please, don't laugh at me. I know this story sounds silly, but just think about what I saw that day while we were out there on the job site. Who knows? I guess you can call this a Bigfoot sighting or an experience with something more. It was beyond terrifying when it happened. And even today, years later, when I envision that thing's face coming at me, I still get goosebumps just thinking about it. I'm the witness. On May 18th, 2018, at around 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, Washington State, my fiancé and I stopped by a small county park. We were looking for elk in the area when something caught our attention. It was in the tall grass about 50 feet away. We could see that it was crouched down and moving very slowly on all fours. We thought maybe it was an injured animal, maybe a large dog, with how it was kind of moving. But then, it just randomly stood up on two legs and began accelerating in movement speed, all the while making these horrific shrieking sounds. I've heard howls from coyotes in packs and even lone wolves before. This was nothing like that. These were very long, loud, drawn-out screams. I will never forget them. My spine itself tingled, and the hair on my entire body stood up, feeling more frightened than I ever have before in my life. Once it ran away, and reached probably about 80 feet away from us, it stopped, went back down on all fours, but continued to make this shrieking noise. We lost sight of it pretty quickly, and we were the only ones around. We kind of were just speechless and walked back to the truck, not saying much of anything. Neither of us could really believe what had just happened. When we got out there initially, it was dark, so we didn't realize just how far away it was or what else was out there with us. My fiancé still claims that it was a badly injured dog, but I don't know. The way my fiancé still thinks about the shriek, it kind of bothers us. It didn't look like a normal dog, and it didn't act like a normal animal. And obviously, the standing up on two legs and running off is a huge red flag, of course. But forgive me because I'm just trying to rationalize it. Apparently, the local American Indian tribes also believed these things were real and living amongst us for hundreds of years. Bigfoot, dogman, dugways, I don't know. I've not been back to the park since, but reading experiences similar to mine on the internet, I have to maybe believe that this was possibly a gugwe or skinwalker, which is what the local Native Americans have called it, when my fiance and I have asked about it and tried to research, although I'm still unsure. I had hiked into this small creek area and was going back heading to my car. I see this small grouping of trees, 3 to 4 of them. Thought it would be a great place to take a break from the sun. I walked over towards it, but didn't really look up until I got closer to the shade, about 20 feet away from them. I noticed something up on top of them. I couldn't really make out what it was, but some kind of animal with 4 legs, but different proportions than any creature I've seen. It was kind of up on this large, tall branch. It was just up there, staring down, kind of hunched in a fetal position. I didn't recognize what it was, so I was definitely freaked out, and I slowly began to back away. It never moved off the tree, and eventually, after about 3 minutes, it just kind of disappeared into thin air, while remaining upright on the top of the tree. As I continued to walk backwards while looking at where this thing had been, I began hearing sounds coming from all around me. Snapping sounds and fallen wood, sounding like something was big. Suddenly, I heard this loud howl or yelp off in the distance in the forest. It sounded like a very large dog, and it sounded more like a large pack of wolves coming, but they had a human quality to them. Like it was like a wolf's howl but mixed with a human yell. I ran before anything could really happen. I've since thought about this encounter many times, and I'm still not sure what it was I saw in the tree, but it was some sort of large animal crouched up on a very tall branch. It was kind of like a monkey, but it wasn't a monkey. It was maybe kind of canine-ish, but it was fetal together, like the way a monkey would hold itself. It's very hard to explain. It also doesn't help the lighting wasn't that great, but you could clearly see something large was up there, and it definitely was not a bird. It gave me chills, to be honest. And then when I heard those howls that were very disturbing, that was just the icing on the cake for me. And it made me never want to go back. I had no reason so. Take from my sighting or encounter what you will, but I know it was nothing normal. This was something very, very strange. Greetings and salutations. Thank you for taking the time to read this story. It's not my own, but my friend's. The encounter occurred back in 1979, when he was just 16 at the time. He had been out fishing with his father on one of their traditional days out together. His father has since passed away, so getting any additional information is possible, unfortunately. The location is Vashon Island, just offshore from Seattle, and apparently, from what I've heard, is home to a small community of what people refer to as werewolves, or I guess people from the Midwest know as dogmen. My friend and his father had apparently gone camping on the island during the day, staying overnight in a cabin that they owned. These wolves, dogmen, whatever, came around when their dog began barking like crazy at something outside. What was described to me is pretty graphic and terrifying, so I'm going to do my best not to elaborate or embellish. These creatures were described as being 8 to 9 feet tall, black and gray, or kind of smoky color, long pointed ears that are said to protrude straight out from the back of the head, large round eyes that kind of glowed, and a mouth full of razor teeth, where each one is extremely pointed. In fact, the comparison he made is if you've ever seen those dinosaur movies, like Jurassic Park, and you see how some of those teeth are, where there's a bunch of teeth in the mouth and each one is pinpoint sharp. That's how these things' teeth were. Completely unnatural for any canine to have. These were alpha killers. These creatures also walked around on 2 legs, just like a man's legs. They were not hawked like a dog, nor did they bend back. These were bipeds, and they moved like bipeds, not just like some animal that was only used to walking on its hind legs for a short distance, like a bear. So that's how we know this was not a misidentification, but something else entirely. One detail he did not forget to describe for me was their smell. He described it as wet dog and rotting meat and blood. And also there was kind of an earthy undertone mixed in there, along with the stench. It made him gag every time he knew they were around. And he would also notice the sound outside going completely silent, and it made his father very unnerved. They would always hear this heavy breathing and kind of a panting noise. I guess one of these creatures tried to pull his father out of his sleeping bag, but he shot one right in the eye, blowing its eyeball out, where it retreated into the woods, howling and screaming. My friend was convinced this thing wanted to eat him and his father, but his father kept him protected all night. The experience was so traumatic for both of them that they just packed up that night and left, while leaving all their camping equipment and even food supplies. They did return days later to retrieve it, but said that the lingering odor of these things was so strong they did not feel safe to stick around for very long. Plus, at the time they came to retrieve their equipment and supplies, it was nearing nighttime, and they knew, once the sun went down, these things would probably be in their full pursuit. I think that's just about everything I can remember about the story. If you want to know more, feel free to email me back. I can gladly ask him more about his experience and the sighting. Have a good day. I just wanted to give you guys an update on this story. I was recently looking through a magazine from the 30s or 40s and found a very similar story about a Bigfoot sighting in the Olympics. A hunter who had seen something walking upright along a ridge while hunting deer one day during the 1920s. It didn't appear to have much of a face, but had red eyes that glowed in the dark when his flashlights hit them. The hunter's dog went absolutely ballistic and took off. Then he had heard screams and growling coming from below him. Apparently, one of his hunter friends had disappeared. He had gone down there with another man, but all they found were some bloodstains and his torn-up clothing, and a bunch of claw marks. They never found out what happened to the other hunter and his dog. What they did find, though, was very interesting. There were a group of Native Americans living in the area, and they had both claimed that some large animal had killed two of their women, members of their tribe about 10 years before. They were even able to show where it had took them and eaten them, or so they believed. In the ground, you could see tracks that were not of a human, but much larger. They were also clawed tracks. The hunter described this thing as half man, half orangutan, but with long claws and teeth, much bigger than anything you could have seen. The Native Americans were also terrified to even talk about it. They wouldn't go near it. The presence of this creature in both cases is what makes me think there's truth to this story. I guess, of course, you gotta take these all with a grain of salt if you want, but when you add up an old story like this, natives have no reason to make this stuff up. I mean, there's many written documentation that tribes all over the country have been dealing with similar like creatures. This has been ongoing for a very long time. In fact, just speak to any native, and most of them will tell you they have their own run-ins or know people who have had run-ins with these creatures. They spend far more time out in the wilderness than we do. They're much more knowledgeable, much more reliant on their intuition. If there's anybody's sighting story to trust, it's theirs. That about sums this up. Thanks again for reading my story. This was when I went outside of Bellevue, closer to Seattle. I was in my car when I spotted a large dark figure on the right side of me on my driver's side window. It made me slam on my brakes and just stare because what I saw was not a bear. It was kind of crouched down behind a bush, but definitely not a man either. I can recall its fur being very shaggy, very black. It had very broad shoulders and was facing away from me towards a big log. I don't think it exactly heard me or saw my car, but before it could, I threw myself in reverse, peeling out of there. I was so scared by the sighting that I had no idea what it could have been, but definitely not a bear as I've said, or any other animal that I've seen before. It definitely reminded me of the Patterson footage, and I'm very skeptical of those videos, but what this was There's no way this was just somebody in a costume. By the way, this happened back in 2007. This was too real for me. This was right outside of Seattle, not very far. If anybody else has any possible encounters that are similar, please do tell. I've never seen anything like this before, that's for sure. A question that I have is that if there are more of these creatures out there, and they are remaining hidden, does that mean they're dangerous? I don't know if there are any reports of aggressive behavior on the part of these creatures, or maybe they're Bigfoot. Maybe they're just quite timid beings and not all that interested in harming humans. I'm just curious. I've been living in the Tri-Cities area, east of Yakima, since the 80s. I was about 15 or 16 when I started seeing something in the yard. The first few times, it would just be a shadow of some sort, but eventually, this turned into a full-fledged animal. Now keep in mind, this is right at my back door, so whatever it is had to have been huge. Initially, I thought it might have been one of the neighbor's German shepherds that were notorious for escaping, but after looking around for this dog, and not finding anything dog-like, I'd go back inside. The next night, same thing. I'd go outside and there it was again, standing between two large pine trees, only about 25 feet away. At this point, I try and decide to get a better look at it. It clearly stood on two legs just like a person, but from my angle and distance, I could only see shadows, as it stood about 9 feet tall and had very long hair. I noticed it was also watching me and very skinny looking. Then it dropped down to all fours and bolted off behind the woods of our house. I had never seen anything like this before in my life, so I didn't know what to think of it for a long time. I've since tried to do some research and talk to friends and family who've also seen similar things. I think we've all come to the conclusion that this was a skinwalker. A little more research has turned up some pretty disturbing facts about the subject, which seems authentic enough to be true. I won't go into too much detail on here. I don't want this thing getting any ideas on coming back. I will say that it seems these things are nocturnal, since it appears at nighttime a lot, and appears very active around our house. I can only assume that it uses illusions to lure you in, so they can get close enough to catch you. Well, I can remember about 2 months going by, and I started seeing it a lot. This time, it tried to get inside our house, and we would always see it outside the back window, which would appear and take the shape of a large shadow, just this large mass, and have long stringy hair. We could never see any eyes or mouth or face, but you could just know when it was out there, when it was staring at you, watching your every move. This thing would just stand there deathly still, staring off at us for what seemed like forever. Although the very first time, I had not noticed it, until I looked over and saw the shape there, watching us. I began to scream my head off. I can remember my father come running into the room, thinking a stranger had broken in to try and kill me, although it might have well as been. He found nothing out of place, except for me curled up under my sheets, screaming. He got me to calm down, and what happened? He actually went outside for us and looked around. Well, there was nothing there. Nothing that he could find. A few years go by, and my grandmother starts having the same thing happen to her. She lives quite a bit of ways though, but still in the same area. She said this thing would take shape as a shadowy man and just sit at the foot of her bed, staring at her until she finally screamed herself awake, because it would appear in her nightmares, and she feels it was actually there in real life. It did not seem to follow us after this though, and one day it just seemed to disappear altogether. I believe these things are real, and they exist. They can take whatever shape they want, since skinwalkers are actually shapeshifters after all. They can manifest into physical beings, or they can turn into supernatural ones, kind of like a magic trick. My solution? Do not go outside alone at night. I'm not kidding you on that one. I think my friends and I stumbled upon a portal in the woods. We were staying in this cabin once, owned by my friend's great-grandfather, who just recently had passed away. The house was pretty small, but it had an upstairs with one bedroom and an old TV. That night, we were hanging out downstairs, drinking beer, popping popcorn, and watching movies. We kept the windows closed, even though there wasn't much ventilation. The only way to get to the house was through a trail near the river in the middle of these massive woods. This was northeastern Washington state. It started to get really hot up there, so my other friend Max said, "Screw it. Let's open up some windows before we die of a heat stroke." But when I opened them, I felt this rush of cold air come into the room, and it made everybody stop what we were doing to see what was going on. It was pretty hot out, so this was very out of place. And it felt wrong. Like there felt something more than just the air, like a presence that came in with it. All of us got goosebumps. And my friend Lisa turned and we saw something moving down by the river. And we could smell something, this kind of putrid, stinky smell. I can't describe it. And this was also when it was dark out, but just barely light enough, because the sun was just about to fully set. And she, Lisa, could see something very big traveling across the water by the trees. She started freaking out, telling us to come see. But when we all looked outside, all we saw was an open trail leading up to the woods by the creek. Something could have been there, but it's pretty hard to make out though, just due to how dark it is. It did not look like a person or animal though. Everything around there is small enough to be mistaken for something else. I wasn't entirely sure what she saw, but whatever it was definitely making its way across that river, disappearing into the woods. So me and Max decided that maybe we should shut the windows, now that we're getting these really bad vibes. We felt cold now, despite it being summer. Our necks kept getting hair on end, and Lisa began complaining that she was feeling dizzy and faint, and I was getting very anxious for some reason. The last thing she remembers happening that night before falling unconscious was seeing something big moving in the trees by the river again. At this point, we're all arguing about whether or not to shut the windows. Nobody else saw it though, because they were either in another room, looking through a window at the other side of the house, or outside with their heads turned away from her. After closing the windows, everything was fine for like 10 minutes, max. We turned back to our usual antics, or at least tried to, and then I began feeling unwell. So, me and Max went upstairs to take a break. He laid on a bed, watching some TV up there, and I sat by the window, trying to relax after whatever weird events have transpired, just trying to forget about everything and unwind. I swear, it felt like we all were being watched from outside, even though nobody else was there, and it was just us. Then, we hear Lisa start screaming that something big is moving through the trees across the creek again, moving towards the property. I took a glance myself and convinced her it must have just been a deer. But as soon as it had fully emerged from those trees, my jaw hit the floor. It looked like some sort of large big animal, covered in hair, with glowing eyes. Its face was somewhat human, but the flesh was pulled back, and it kind of looked like a cross between a man, a wolf, and a bear. And it started ascending up the hill towards the house. It kind of lumbered and walked strange, like it was drunk. We all just got this feeling of pure dread just sitting in our stomachs. I couldn't move, just staring at it coming closer and closer towards my room. That's when Max woke up from his nap. He turned around and saw what was happening just in time. He grabbed his flashlight, started screaming into the hallway before he ran away. Max grabbed it, shined the light towards it, and began screaming at it, telling it to go away. I was panicking. Then I heard Lisa's door slam. This thing tried to break into the house. You could tell it was slamming on the windows and slamming on the doors. All of us were completely petrified. Max pulled out his old .22 that he had brought with him and started shooting at this thing and shooting up in the air, trying to make as much noise as possible. I think he scared it off for the time being, because it quickly disappeared into the trees. After he got it scared away, he managed to try and calm himself down, and we were all trying to calm down. We were pretty traumatized by what had happened, all trying to rapidly question each other. What was that? Did you see what that was? I don't know. What do you think it was? Luckily, Emily had cell service, so she called 911 and said that we had an intruder. Well, when the cops came, they looked pretty confused about what we explained happened, so I'm guessing they didn't really believe us. But they sure looked surprised pulling up and seeing Max waving his rifle outside, looking like a crazy person. Overall, it still feels like a very traumatic memory, and it's probably the last time I decided to go camping for a few days up in a cabin in the woods. Even now, I don't really like answering questions about what happened. But if I get asked, I'll be sure to tell anybody, since I stand firm by what I experienced. Lisa and Max and Emily, to this day, will not speak a word about it. In fact, they simply act as if none of this even happened. They won't acknowledge it. So it's never really talked about, and therefore in the past. But I figured people would probably want to hear about what happened, to know that camping in the woods isn't always as safe as everybody in society make it out to be. We were camping in the Gifford Pinchot Forest. This is in Washington State, for my daughter's 4th birthday. She loves camping, and I wanted to make it extra special by taking her on a special overnight trip. It was roughly 10 or 11 o'clock at night, and we all saw something very strange. I can remember seeing lights up in the path that leads to the woods. We were staying near a lake. I thought somebody might be having car trouble or something. But then all of a sudden, these dark shadows began moving toward us from the forest. Several dark entities moving through the air. They were definitely humanoid, 2 legs, 2 arms kind of thing. But they did not look human, and they were levitating. They moved right past one neighbor who had their dogs beside them. The dogs did not move or make a sound, which I found odd, like the dogs did not notice them, and neither did the neighbors. I honestly thought it was evil spirits coming to attack us in the middle of the night. I kind of feel silly for overreacting, but what was I supposed to do? I thought we were in danger. Thank God they evaporated or disappeared. I have a big floodlight attached to the back of my truck, and so I started shining it around. They had disappeared already. Didn't see them again. Very, very weird. Good thing we had the spotlight. It was pretty scary. So later on we learned that this area is apparently haunted by Native Americans. Interesting. Were these shadow men some sort of ghost? How did they even walk through the air? It was very, very creepy. I can remember this like it was yesterday, but this was back in early 2014. A buddy of mine and I were doing some camping out in the woods, not too far north from Seattle. We had our guns locked and loaded, ready for anything that might be wandering around. We weren't exactly hunting per se, just seeing if anything strange would wander into range. What happened was definitely unexpected. As it began to get dark, we thought the forest was becoming silent. But then I heard a twig snap over by some bush. I pointed my guns toward it, as my friend came in with an extra light to see what made the sound. What we saw is something I will never forget. A white figure with huge black eyes staring back at us. It looked like something right out of a horror movie. It was on all fours and had these strange, broken arms and legs. It crawled like a spider. I decided to shoot at it, but my friend quickly grabbed me before I could. While this thing did not move, I heard some rustling in the bushes behind us. My friend went over to see what made the noise, and I kept my gun pointed towards this thing. There was another one behind us. After that, we both pointed our guns at this thing. Surrounded, now we felt threatened. Then they quickly just kind of scattered off. Completely horrified by something we had never seen before. We're now convinced, after looking online, this was a run-in with skinwalkers, or whatever you want to call them. To my knowledge, there has never been any stories about something like this anywhere near Seattle, or even Washington for that matter. So, now here we all are, wondering about these strange creatures. Their eyes were so intense I could never forget them. It's like they were looking into my soul, but in the worst way possible. They scared the living hell out of me. Now, I feel like there is something more in the woods than just animals wandering around. I would love to know what any of you guys think about my encounter, or if anybody else had had something similar happen. Thanks for reading my post. I used to live right near North Bend, Washington. The town is known for the supposed Blair Witch Project movie being filmed there. It's also home to around 14,000 people and has a gorge running through it. It was also the site of a landslide back in 2006. I used to live right across from Snoqualmie Falls, years ago during my time living, and I had 2 sightings of goatmen, both of which were close distance of each other. Once, while walking down an old road that leads into this area by my house very late at night, right around 2 in the morning, I woke up and found a large human-like print pressed deep into the mud on this path that leads out to these woods, which is full of old game trails and logging roads. We also caught some large animal noises coming from those woods back then. Very strange noises that you can't exactly put to an animal. A few years down the road, I went on a hike up a trail very close to the site of the very first sighting with a friend. We tried to take some pictures and were going to post them online, had they not been too dark. I'm nowhere near a professional photographer. It's noteworthy that both times I spotted him, he appeared to be very, very dark, as if wet and covered in fur and dirt. Kind of appeared to be ape-like, but appeared more goat-like than anything else. No one believed us at all. We had tried telling people that we've seen a goat man, but nobody believed us. Thanks for your time. I should also mention that we never saw him during the day. It always seemed to be at dusk or almost night. It's believed by some people living around here that he's been spotted roaming these woods for decades now. Even the natives think that, and many tribes around here in central Washington have stories about the supposed goat man. What do you think? Recently, I began dating a girl who told me about an experience that she had while growing up. She was driving home from work through a very remote area of western Washington at night. Her little sister in the passenger seat. It was raining pretty hard and the visibility was very poor due to this. As they were rounding a corner at high speed, she claims there was something large standing on 2 legs next to the road that appeared out of nowhere. Instantly, she recognized this as some kind of animal. She slammed on the brakes and skidded off to one side of the road almost in a ditch, rather than hitting whatever it was. Her younger sister began screaming and pointing at this thing, so my girlfriend shut her car off to let the car calm down, in hopes that it would have left her alone, and suddenly heard gargling sounds coming from their left. She turned her head to look out the side window, and there was this large hairy creature walking around on 2 legs, looking at them through the very back window. She claims that it appeared to have sloped shoulders which led down to very bony, elongated arms. She claimed that it put both its hands up against the back seat windows as if trying to grab onto them, or trying to reach through the windows, which were slightly down. She claims that it reared back several times as if trying to hit the car, before finally becoming frustrated and walking away, still hunched over. She claims that this thing also had an awful stench accompanying it, that it smelled like hot garbage left out in the summer, and really, really bad BO. The reason why I find this story so interesting is because shortly after they drove home, my girlfriend told me that she was the only one who in her entire family has seen one of these things, and she's also a very analytical, scientific person. She is probably the biggest Bigfoot skeptic you can think, and so for her to have an account like this just proves that even the most scientific of people who don't want to believe anything can experience things that are out of the realm of question. I believe it was a Bigfoot, and I've told her that myself. She doesn't want to put that to it and say she had a Bigfoot encounter, but she agrees that it definitely wasn't something normal. Very, very odd indeed. Back in 2011, I went on a short hiking trip with my daughter. We were at the base of a small mountain, and my daughter said she was thirsty, so we stopped at a stream about 100 feet away from it. She gets out and she's looking into the forest, I guess for some water, and I see her run back to the car, all scared, telling me that there is an evil spirit. She says it looks like a goblin. I thought she was just playing a prank or being jokeful, but slowly, it begins coming out towards us, from behind the rocks, almost like it was trying not to get caught. And I see this thing. It's probably about 4 to 5 feet tall, very dark in color and very, very ugly looking. But it definitely looked like a small humanoid, easily the size of maybe a 9 or 10-year-old child. I got a pretty good look at it, and it freaked me and my daughter out, because as soon as it showed itself from behind the rock where my daughter just was, she was now screaming, and we drove to get away from this thing. I mean, it was only about 20 feet away. I don't know what this thing was, and quite frankly, I don't want to know. I was out rummaging around in the woods in Washington, and I found what looked to be an old abandoned prison. Maybe it was a hospital. I couldn't tell. It was just a big old slab of concrete, overtaken by nature in the woods. But before I could explore further, shadows moved about, and for a moment I could have sworn I saw a shape take into something really big. A physical manifestation. And sure enough, he stood there, swaying back and forth like a tree in the wind. Naked, but his skin looking wrinkled and old, like he had been put through too much bad weather. He was very tall and black as night, gnarly teeth protruding from its mouth. His face appeared deformed, like it had been melted, or put too close to a fire. Long spindly fingers and jagged sharp nails. It began to move towards me, like some sort of demonic Nosferatu, and I panicked. I couldn't even bring myself to scream or run away, because of the sheer terror that came over me. I don't know how I did it. Just as he's reaching out for me, about to grab my throat, I fell backwards, out in the sunlight, and I realized he kind of hissed and did not want to get out in the light. He was still under the shadow of the darkness of the building. I realized as long as I was in the sunlight, I was okay, and so I fled. I don't know what this demonic being was, or if it was a demon at all, but I later learned out from some friends that this site that I was at was actually a pretty heavy location for satanic rituals and occult practices. I guess they would do a lot of animal sacrifices in this building, and that apparently, word of mouth is that demons now roamed and protected this building, or what used to be one, which leads me to conclude that what I had encountered was indeed a demon of some kind that had taken physical manifestation. Call me crazy, but I know what I saw. I think I saw something like this just in Washington state. I don't really know if I should believe what happened or maybe just say it was a nightmare. Maybe because the amount of drugs and alcohol that I used to consume, maybe that's permanently fried me, but I saw something that nobody else did, and wondering if somebody could explain some things. Sorry for the initial rambling, but hopefully somebody out here can help me figure out what is going on. I live around Seattle, Washington, where there are a lot of cemeteries. My husband had moved here from Arizona. We were driving through one at night with his mom. Side note, his mom had lived in Amsterdam and flew over to see him and then flew up to see us. And we were lost at the time. This is when he hadn't been living here for long. We drove around for like an hour looking for the house we were going to be staying at. It was an Airbnb. It was also late. Everything was dead silent. We finally found our way out of this forested area and started on a street with a lot of homes. We see two red eyes staring at us from the side of the road. They looked like eyes, but not animal eyes, like glowing orbs up in the trees. I asked, "What on earth are those?" And his mom said she didn't know. My husband figured it must be some sort of animal or maybe a reflection off a mirror. But his mom is a medium and kept saying that there's a dark energy out tonight. I didn't think this could happen. I mean, we're up on a mountain. There aren't many houses here to begin with. Especially having this kind of thing out here, it didn't really make any sense. So anyway, we get home and everything kind of seems okay. We get settled into the Airbnb, which I call home because it was so nice, and my husband, who was going to go out with me and party, decides to just lay low for the night. But him and his mom are just going to kind of relax and watch some TV. I bid him farewell, and I was going to go out partying with my friends. So I did. I went out that night and started drinking in a bar. I'm not going to go into details about this part, but I got pretty messed up on everything you can imagine. One of my guy friends told me he wanted to show me something cool before we headed back home. So we went for a walk in this huge cemetery near where I lived. I was texting my husband to see if he was okay. He was just going to bed and wished me good night. I told him how many stars were out in the sky and how bright the moon was, wishing he was here. Me and my friend walked down this row of graves that looked like they hadn't been used in a while. It made me think about what would happen if somebody got buried alive. I don't know why my brain went to that thought, but I shivered at the thought of it. The thought about how terrible that would be. And I mentioned it to my friend and laughed about it. Then he said, "Look," pointing to a grave with a broken marble headstone covered in moss. It had these really ornate engravings on the top half, but underneath were claw marks in the stone, like something huge had torn pieces out of the stone. Then he started telling me scary stories about what could have caused them, that maybe there's a demon out in this graveyard who guards it. And just then, I could have sworn that when I looked up, I thought we were being watched. So I tried to get us to exit the graveyard, while still keeping an eye out for whatever. I kept glancing back over my shoulder, but saw nothing there anymore. While looking for it again, I see yet another pair of red eyes on some gravestones nearby. This was right near the entrance of the graveyard. Now the wind was suddenly picking up, and the trees were really rustling. Everything seemed to fall silent, and even my friend did not say anything. I could tell he was getting unnerved and really bothered by what was going on, which is really odd for him since he's Mr. Talkative and will talk your ear off, even in a bad situation. There's nothing that'll sober you up quicker than feeling like you are being haunted by demons in a graveyard. We both booked it out of that graveyard quick, without looking back. It was getting late anyway, and plus, my feet were starting to hurt, running on the gravel road. But the entire time after my friend and I had exited, we felt like we were being followed, and if anything, we were watched. I didn't see anybody, but the feeling was very eerie. We ended up getting an Uber back to the bar, meeting up with our other friends, and I got an Uber back home, saying my goodbyes. At this point, I was pretty sober. I guess my whole point is this whole experience has really been bothering me since. I'd really appreciate any help if this was really demonic or not. I mean, maybe my husband's mom wasn't wrong. There was a dark energy out tonight, and it had been following us around. Why? I'm not sure. But it's maybe possible my mind was just playing tricks on me. Maybe it was alcohol-induced, I don't know. But I've been drunk many times before. I've never had anything weird like this happen. Either of my friends. I'm not sure if I'll ever be going back out there again, without somebody else more trustworthy with me. Maybe these were demons, I don't know. I'm still trying to decide on all this. I have been living in Washington for about 6 months now. I am ex-military, so I know what a serpent looks like. But when I saw the lizard man, it was quite a different experience altogether. Last night, 9:13 p.m., while at my house, my dog and another neighborhood dog were barking and growling outside at something. I told them to shut up, thinking it was just coyotes or maybe a mountain lion, until I looked out the window and saw this flipping 9-foot-tall thing standing up on two legs, scratching part of the tree. When I stepped outside to get a better look, and it looked up at me and quickly retreated in the woods behind it. This thing was like half human, half alligator. It scared the living hell out of me. I mean, this was like something I would call an iguana. I quickly knocked on my neighbor's door, asked them if they had just seen the flipping lizard man. This is 100% legit, no BS. My neighbor, totally unfazed, told me how he saw one about 2 years ago at dusk, just standing there, watching, as he smoked a cigarette outside. He said it stood there watching him, in a way that it wanted to eat him. While it definitely spooked me, I want to say this was the first time I've ever seen anything like this, but it's not. You see, Less than a month ago, my other neighbor almost hit one with her car as she was driving home, I found out. She said it looked at her and then began to run in the road, just barely missing her vehicle. It scared her half to death. I think my hypothesis is that this is some lab experiment that has gotten loose. I would imagine that's probably the case. I wonder if the government knows about it. I also hope that they do something to take care of it, preferably kill it. Please spread the news so that people know what they're up against, and know that these things are truly out there. Hi, this was in the spring of 2013, when we first noticed the lizard man. We live right near Washington in Idaho, and had just moved home about a month before this. I was walking out of my room early one morning, probably about 5:30 a.m. or so, and I see this greenish-brownish blur run by my window and onto my brother's window on the other side of the house. Something very big and scaly was moving outside the house. That's when I got a clear view of it from my window. It was no doubt a lizard man, running on his two back legs, with his front arms swinging by its side. Very muscular, very reptilian spikes and ridges on its back, like the ones you would see in a cartoon or art. It also looked very amphibious, like it belonged in the water, or so I thought. It was kind of a greenish brown. I could faintly see its face, but I remember seeing crocodilian-like teeth. But it moved so quickly and disappeared, I did not get the best look at its face. It just appeared like it was on a mission somewhere, to go to God only knows where. Come to find out that my brother saw him too, and he ran from our window straight to his window next door, where he stood there staring at him. My brother was terrified, thinking he had seen some sort of monster or something that came from hell. The next day, there were massive claw marks along the siding of our house. It looked like somebody had taken a small rake and clawed all the way upside of our house, about 11 feet up off the ground, right by the gutters. We looked around the neighborhood and finally found one person who lived within view of our house. They refused to acknowledge what we talked about. It was really awkward to bring up. I mean, what are you supposed to do? Hey, have you seen a 9-foot-tall walking lizard? So we just kind of hinted that we saw something strange, and the man looked like he knew what we were talking about, but became nervous and refused and shut the conversation down right there. Now we've moved, but I can tell you that we've always seen black bears, elk and coyotes and eagles, lots of fish, but this definitely wasn't a bear or anything like that. It wasn't any kind of primate either. It was faster than any animal I've seen before, and as far as I know, there are no giant lizards running around. But I do know of the lizard man. I just never thought in a million years I would ever get the chance to see him myself. And I'll never forget the way it felt seeing him, just staring outside. I felt like my heart darn near stopped when I saw it, because I realized that it's actually a real living creature. Anyway, it's been about 8 years now since this happened, and we always talk about him every time we get together. No one in our town has ever heard of seeing such a creature before, but they all seem to know who we're talking about when we describe what he looks like. I still think about him a lot. I wonder if this creature comes around. I sure hope not. I mean, it's too frightening. I know a lot of people who live around here say they've seen Bigfoots too. And I've watched the show Finding Bigfoot. I wonder if they would ever do one on the lizard man. All I can say is I hope I never have to see it again. It was that scary. Hi, my name is Amanda. I'm 22 years old. The following thing happened to me when I was 19. I grew up in Forks, Washington, which has around 3,000 residents, if you include all the surrounding area. It's surrounded by forest and is perched right next to the Olympic Mountains. The town sits on a peninsula, so basically everything that isn't water ends up being forests or mountains at some point during your travels. My friend Mandy, who goes by Mando, lives in Port Angeles, about an hour away from me, via car depending on traffic. We've been friends ever since we started attending school together during middle school. She lived with her parents while I rented a house of my own with another friend from college. To give you a little background about myself and Mando, we both enrolled in Forks High School, but we didn't really become friends until later, after our junior year. Even though I guess we were kind of friends in middle school, we weren't really friends until then. Mando claims that I have a gift to be a psychic, but she claims to be a psychic as well, and she feels she wants to understand me better. Even before this occurred, Mando had never been one to shy away from anything or anyone else around her, which is why I trusted her enough to tell her everything about me, and why I don't like going into the forests near my home. She knows about the Wendigo, though she doesn't know exactly what I encountered out there. Mando eventually moved into my old house with her new husband after they got married, once both of them finished their respective degrees. We both got a head start in college and high school, getting into one of those special programs, so we got our degrees pretty early. And not too long ago, I found myself driving back to the Forks after completing my degree. My parents now live in Connecticut, so going back in time, it's now May of 2018, and I'm finishing up my classes in order to graduate. It had been a week or so since the semester ended, which meant that I finally had some time off, like most people do once their final exams are over. Mando couldn't make it for the weekend because of work. It's about 2 hours north, so it's a long drive for her, but she said she can come up for the weekend and make sure I wasn't too lonely. However, Friday night starts out with me falling asleep on the couch, watching TV around 8 p.m. I woke up sometime later during the night. I'm not entirely sure when, but judging by how dark it was outside and how quiet my house was, I knew that it must have been somewhere between 1 to 3 a.m. The moon didn't look quite right to me at first glance, which kind of startled me. Normally, seeing things like that doesn't really bother me much, unless they're directly affecting somebody else or close to me directly. Curiosity got the better of me, since I couldn't think of anything else to do. I decided to investigate outside, but not before grabbing an extra knife or so. You can never be too safe in case there is something dangerous. I'd at least prefer to be able to defend myself. I turned on all the lights as a precaution, making my way straight down the driveway. It was still dark enough that there weren't many cars out traveling at this hour. Luckily for me, there were more footprints than tire tracks leading into the forest where my house sits on top of a hill. No matter how much you want to search for answers about something, one part of you knows exactly what you're looking for once you find it. I think that describes this situation to a T. The further I went into the forest, the more certain I was that those footprints belonged to something inhuman. It wasn't just because they were bigger than any human's feet could possibly be. There were too many prints. None of them looking like they even walked in a straight line. Really long strides. I finally gave up trying to rationalize being so deep in the woods at night by myself, turning back around one last look from where I'd come from, to make sure nothing had followed me. Did it all really seem like it was worth whatever the answer was? I was halfway back at my driveway, and I heard a noise. Someone or something was walking through them, and it sounded like they were getting closer. Whatever it must have been had since seen me. It began moving towards the road right after. The only thing that is my driveway has a curve in it, so there's no way they'd be able to see me from where we're coming from, without actually coming into the open. That did not stop me from panicking though, seeing as how my house sits on top of a hill, while all these trees cover most of my property. Going inside probably was going to save me, if this thing wanted to get me. I was scared, and even considered just dropping all my stuff and running. But then something about this being's movement pattern made me stop to watch for a second. I have a hard time going into much detail, because writing about this thing gives me chills. But whatever it wasn't walking. It was kind of slithering around, while it moved itself with these appendages. I couldn't see any sort of face or arms that looked like they were attached to anything other than a torso, but it was extremely long and thin. If indeed it had any eyes at all, they were either at the very top of its head or sunken deep into the side of what I imagined its skull to look like. Another thing I noticed was that there were 2 small holes or slits in the side of what my eyes could make out as its head. It looked like it had gills or something on the side of its face. But this is probably just me looking for some sort of explanation, when there's really none, for something so far outside the realm of normalcy. There was no way I could outrun whatever this was, if it turned around and wanted to eat me. All I could do was stand still and hope that whatever protective powers my house was could save me instead. It went up onto the road, after moving past where my driveway curves. This gave me a clear enough look to see that it wasn't initially a wendigo, like I had thought, but something like a large serpent, but more terrifying. Its long appendages dragging behind it, like some sort of strange alien-looking creature. It was moving so fast and it was so large. It took only a few seconds for this thing to clear the road and go over and up the curb for my lawn. There's no way something like what I saw can move so quickly, especially not without making noise. But the entire time this happened, I could not hear a single sound coming from whatever this was. No crunching, no moving, nothing. Nothing. I was so shaken up by this, I just wanted to get inside. Maybe call somebody to come help me. Figure out what it was I saw. The only problem with that plan is that whatever this thing was, certainly was nothing I've ever seen before. And despite all of this, I'm not sure what I saw, but I know for a fact it wasn't a human, or any sort of snake or thing I've ever seen in my entire life. But my senses tell me this was something of the paranormal realm. I should be happy and glad that it's gone now. And after this, other strange things started to happen. Like for example that night, after it disappeared, within 10 minutes, a brewing thunderstorm came in. It was very strange. And at this point, I don't really know what to think. All I really want to do is just try and forget about it. So now at nighttime, I keep everything locked up. My windows tight, my doors shut. Even though I'm sure if this thing comes around again and wants to get in, it could very well easily. I don't know if anybody else out there has seen what I've saw. Since I can't find reports of anything like it, I guess I'm all alone. I can only hope and pray that this thing just doesn't come back. My sisters and I stumbled across a strange creature in the middle of nowhere, just outside of Winthrop, Washington. It was about 4:30 p.m. We were driving back from Seattle, decided to take a US Route 20 towards California. About 50 miles out, we pulled off onto an empty road so my sister could take a piss by the side of the road, since there were no restaurants or gas stations for another good amount of time. She walks away from us up a small hill next to the road, and noticed something coming towards her at an incredible speed. It looked like it was running on all fours, but when we squinted our eyes, we realized it wasn't actually running at all, but that its body was slightly slanted forward with its head and arms kind of leaning towards the ground, like a drunken person. All we could see was a tall shadow moving towards my sister at very fast speed, and that it had long legs and arms. It had started off as just a tall black figure, but as it got closer, it became more defined and we realized its body was brown and very dark. It moved very awkwardly and like lightning, and once our eyes adjusted, this thing wasn't actually running or walking, but kind of gliding through the air. We started screaming at our sister. When she yells back, "I don't know what it is, but it's not stopping," and she comes running back to the car. And after she realized this thing had no intention of slowing down, because it was running at her, not around her, she jumps in the car, screams at me to drive. So I floored it for about 5 miles, not looking back at seeing what this mysterious person or thing was that had been chasing my sister. Once we were back on the highway, we all kind of relaxed a little bit. She was shaking from the adrenaline, completely out of breath, but I had to know what that thing was, so I asked if they could describe it while my mind was still fresh on what had happened. She did not get a good look at it, but she was pretty spooked. She explained it had a very slender body, really long skinny legs, and no hair, but said it kind of looked like a wolf, with very dark eyes, and that it was almost black. She said it was terrifying and very creepy looking. She's never seen anything like it before, and I don't know if she will again, or even wants to. My family is from the Yakima Valley. We have all heard stories of the so-called dogman, which has been cited by both family and friends. I would personally like to share my experience with all of you. One night, when I was 15, I received a frantic phone call from my brother, who was 14. He told me he had just witnessed something that cannot be explained away as a trick of the light, or simply human error. My brother described seeing what appeared to be a very tall man with an overly large head, like a dog's, long skinny arms running across our barnyard on all fours. He said it stopped and turned its head, slowly in his direction, noticed him, then continued on his way. To this day, I still see my brother telling me about that night, and will never forget it. This thing is, I believe him 100%. The tone of voice he was in, my brother was so scared, and he never gets scared of much. So to have him that freaked out had to have been something at the time. He was nearly hysterical. He tells me he does not want his name attached to any of this, and wishes to remain completely anonymous. One time, when I lived in Washington State, my boyfriend and I were driving down a long stretch of road that has no lights on it or houses. This is a pretty rural area, pretty out in the sticks. We had just bought a bunch of fireworks from the store, and we were planning on setting them off in our spot and having a nice bonfire. Don't worry, we were going to make sure to be careful. We got about 5 minutes away from our spot, and we see these large eyes in the distance. So I got scared. It looked like something straight out of a horror movie. When you see eyes and you're scared by them, you were convinced that this was a monster. So my boyfriend pulls over on his shoulder, backs up until he can clearly see whatever it was. He even rolled down the window, stuck his head out of the car and looked up. It was already getting dark, so he couldn't see much. Then once he lifted his arm and turned the headlights on, we saw these very long human-like fingers wrapped around a tree. We sat there, staring at each other in complete disbelief. Then we heard the sound of wet bones popping, and then we see this face pop up from behind a tree. It was all white, had no nose and no mouth, but really large black eyes. We both screamed. He put the car in a drive and we sped out of there. We didn't speak about it the rest of the night, and we never let off the fireworks. In fact, we never even go back there. I never believed that these were things that were real, but as much as this sounds like some lame creepypasta, we have to deal with this memory now. My father had a friend who was a logger. In the 70s, he had heard about Bigfoot activity up in Washington State, but had never actually seen one himself, as they were known to be very aggressive towards humans, avoided them at all costs. He had heard all sorts of horror stories from his friends who were loggers down in Cali. He said that some rangers from the Forest Service reported seeing strange noises and sights, typically coming from wild feral dogs, but sounded wrong. They dismissed it as nothing more than unusual animal sounds, but after a few days of hearing it on a nightly basis, they began to investigate it further, worried that a new pack of wolves had somehow moved into an area. That's when they came across hundreds of rabbits in a clearing, mauled and left for dead. After reporting this to their superiors, they were told not to look into it any further, which is why I believe that this has gone undocumented for so long now. I believe these Bigfoots are demons that have come back to walk the earth in order to influence mankind towards negative behavior. Perhaps it was a warning sign that we as a species have strayed away from values and morals that we should be living by. I think it's important to bring this topic into discussion and hope more people will start looking into it, how Bigfoots interact with humans. They could mean more for our future than we ever know. Not my story, but a friend's. This took place up in Washington State. A few years back, my friend and I were on our way to a party. I don't remember what town we were near, and we saw something very out of the ordinary. We had been drinking and probably shouldn't have been driving, but it is what it is. However, there was a stretch of road that went on for about 2 miles where it was pitch black. No streetlights or houses at all. There was nothing but forest on either side of the road, with about 6 feet of shoulder dirt before you hit the tree line. So it wasn't exactly safe to stop the car either. But anyway, as I'm sure most people are aware, Washington and Oregon alone have very, very many Bigfoot sightings. So it really wouldn't be surprising to find one there, right? This thing we saw was not Bigfoot, but I believe something similar. My friend and I were driving down this road. He was driving because I had been drinking, and he had not been drinking yet. But he did drive later when he was drunk, hence my comment. Anyway, when I look out my window, at right about 45 degrees to see what looked like a big, hairy man thing standing next to the tree line, staring right at me, with its arms to its side, and its palms facing outwards. It kind of reminded me of a gorilla, but much more humanoid looking and uglier. It had black hair all over its body, black eyes, and kind of this really grim expression. I can't exactly say how tall it was, but it wasn't that big. Maybe 6 foot tall, maybe a little bit taller. When I first saw it, I thought it was a man in a bear suit or something, but I quickly realized there was no way somebody could have gone through all the trouble to get into a costume, to stand out here in the middle of nowhere, and look so real. I don't really remember what happened after that. The next thing I knew, we were at the party, and my friend didn't mention anything about seeing whatever it was standing there. We drove back on that road when we left, but of course, we were intoxicated and we didn't really pay attention for any signs of anybody being there, like before. I stepped outside one evening, back in the fall, October of '05. I remember that year very well. That was the year we had a big snowstorm up here, and all the trees got hit really hard. It was a pretty rough winter, but anyway. It was about 7 p.m. at the time. Dusky. I have to back up first, though. I'm not sure why, but for some reason that evening, I just felt compelled to step outside on my deck for a few moments. I didn't know why I had this compulsion, but I decided to sit down on one of my few patio chairs. While sitting there, I pulled out a cigarette, looking around at the dry yellow leaves drifting aimlessly through the air in front of me, and something began moving behind me, which I heard, so I turned around. Because it was getting darker now, there was a lot less light, and it looked to me like there was some large black dog of some kind. Not sure what breed it was, but it sounded very heavy as it was moving. I could see it faintly as it was moving between the trees. I just remember thinking, who let their dog loose? And as soon as I got a better view of it, that's when my blood turned ice cold, and a deep, slow breathing sound mixed with the sort of growl emitted from it. And as soon as this thing showed itself, I got up and ran back to my house, before whatever it was got any closer. As I'm getting up to my house, this thing crouches down, with its face maybe 3 to 4 feet off the ground, getting ready to run, right towards my house. I can remember the whites of its eyes, and the awful grin it had on its face. It was like a malicious smirk, and then it kind of veered back into the woods, but staying right behind the main tree, as if to keep watch, to see if I would go outside again. I closed my sliding glass door curtains, not wanting to look at it again and just forget about it, which I did. The next morning, there was no traces of it. I never saw it again. I still ask myself that what in God's name was that thing? I have no idea. Some sort of dog monster, I guess. Allow me to preface this and say I don't know what kind of supernatural entity I witnessed this evening, but it scared me badly. This was right near the Canadian border, northern Washington state. It was a new moon and it was very, very dark. I'm a big fan of going out for walks and runs right around midnight, if the weather permits. It's not something I do as frequently, but I began doing it more frequently at night, after getting my car broken into about a week ago. It kind of helps me just deal with the stress. Since then, Me and my husband and our dog have been walking every night, right around 11:30 p.m., to burn off some stress, as I said. We live kind of by an island, surrounded by two state forests. We also have a lot of trails around here that we enjoy. The trail we walk, normally, is a straight shot from our house, about 3/4 of a mile before it reaches sand, then another half mile before you reach what we call the dog beach. It's also worth noting that this trail is very rarely hiked, very secluded, and there are no lights and hardly any homes or anybody around it. It's a trail that I would consider very tucked back and hidden. In fact, me and my husband rarely have ever seen anybody else on the trail, even during the daytime. At nighttime, never. So this night, my husband and I were walking our dog. It was right on the cusp of midnight, and we noticed something strange moving. We had just walked past one of the driveways where you first get on the trail, and continued straight on the path. Now, our dogs are kind of hypersensitive to other presences, or so we've known. My great-aunt's house was haunted, and when we visited, our dogs were very aware of the presence there. I'm not saying we ran into a ghost, but it was definitely something supernatural, as the way our dogs reacted. Now, we approached this section of the trail that's about 50 feet long where there's a drop-off on the side, and it's very dense on the right side. And we noticed something off in the distance. Well, apparently, my doggie saw whatever this thing was too, and she took off running towards it, barking up a storm and growling. I'm calling her name and running after her. But as I'm running towards her, she starts whimpering, and I hear this strange animal growl, and the dog comes running back to me. I catch her, and she has this massive gash across her face, and blood is pouring out. I shine my flashlight up, and I see these large glowing eyes, off in the distance, maybe no more than 40 feet away in the trees, and this angry, deep, guttural growl. To say I was panicking is a massive understatement. I just grabbed my husband's hands before he could say anything, and I pulled him back in the opposite direction while cradling my poor dog, who had just gotten attacked by whatever this thing was. And to be honest with you, I don't care what it was. I just know I did not want to be around it, and I could feel that this thing was not natural. It gave off a very bad vibe. Trust me, I've been around wolves and bears my whole life living out here. I know what they look like, and I know what they act like. I don't get that feeling being around them. This was something else and completely unnatural in behavior in every sense of the word.